Imagine a world where your voice is stolen before you can even speak your first word. In the heart of Manhattan's most elite penthouse, a 3-year-old boy named Leo lived in a golden cage of silence. His father, a man who owned half the skyline, thought his son was broken. His stepmother to be thought he was a nuisance. But then came Aaliyah, a woman with a past she was running from, and a gift for hearing the whispers in a child's eyes. She was just the maid, a ghost in a white apron, until the day the silence shattered. On that day, the boy didn't just cry, he spoke. And the 6 words that tumbled from his lips didn't just break the silence, they tore down a dynasty. This is a story about the secrets hidden in plain sight and the mother's love that survived even when it was forgotten. The crystal vase didn't just fall, it exploded. The sound echoed through the marble halls of the sterling penthouse, like a gunshot cutting right through the smooth jazz and the polite laughter of New York's richest guests. Aaliyah Jordan stood frozen, her hands still outstretched as the heavy scent of lilies and expensive citrus filled the air. Across from her stood Tiffany Montgomery, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage that no amount of designer Botox could hide. Tiffany didn't wait for an explanation. She didn't care about the truth. She grabbed a full glass of orange juice from a passing server's tray and hasted the sticky cold liquid directly onto Aaliyah's crisp white uniform. The orange stains spread across Aaliyah's chest like a badge of shame, while the high society guests gasped and whispered behind their manicured hands. Tiffany's voice rose to a shrill, piercing pitch that commanded the room. "You clumsy, incompetent fool," she spat, her eyes darting to the small boy cowering behind Aaliyah's legs. "How dare you lay your filthy hands on my stepson?" Aaliyah felt the sticky juice seeping through her clothes, but she didn't flinch. Her gaze remained fixed on the bowl of honey-roasted peanuts sitting on the low table, the very thing she had been trying to move out of little Leo's reach. She knew the medical charts. She knew the danger. "Ma'am, the boy is severely allergic to nuts," Aaliyah said, her voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I wasn't being clumsy. I was stopping him from touching that bowl. He could go into anaphylactic shock in minutes." Tiffany let out a sharp, mocking laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "You are a maid, not a doctor," she sneered, stepping closer until Aaliyah could smell the expensive gin on her breath. "You are here to scrub floors and stay invisible. My son is fine. What's not fine is my $5,000 silk rug and the fact that a servant is talking back to me in my own home. You think because you have a fancy way of speaking that you're special. You're just another girl from the streets trying to act like you belong in a world that doesn't even see you." Tiffany's hand flew up a blur of diamonds and French tips, and for a second the entire penthouse went silent, waiting for the impact that would change everything. The slap from Tiffany Montgomery echoed through the silent penthouse like a thunderclap in a library. It didn't just leave a stinging heat on Aaliyah's dark skin, it signaled a declaration of war in a world where Aaliyah was supposed to be invisible. But Aaliyah did not flinch or cry out. She stood with her spine as straight as the steel beams of the skyscraper they lived in. Tiffany stepped closer, her face twisted with a level of hatred that went beyond a simple accident. "You think because you have a voice, you have a right to use it?" Tiffany hissed, her words dripping with a venom that no luxury brand could mask. "You are nothing but cleaning trash. You were hired to scrub the grime off the floors, not to look me in the eye, and certainly not to touch a sterling heir." Tiffany grabbed Aaliyah by the shoulder of her juice-soaked uniform, her expensive French-tipped nails digging into the fabric. "Look at you," Tiffany continued, her voice rising, so every socialite in the room could hear. "You come from nothing. You smell like cheap detergent and desperation. You are a ghost in this house, a shadow that should stay in the corners where you belong. If I see you within 10 feet of Leo again, I will make sure the only place you ever work is a prison laundry room." The guests began to snicker, the sound of ice clinking in crystal glasses providing a rhythmic backdrop to Aaliyah's public humiliation. To them, she was just a prop in Tiffany's performance of power. But while Tiffany's mouth was spewing poison, Aaliyah's eyes were doing something far more dangerous. She was observing. She wasn't looking at the diamonds on Tiffany's neck or the rage in her eyes. Aaliyah's gaze was locked on the small, trembling boy caught in the middle. As Tiffany shifted her weight to gesture at the door, the sleeve of Leo's cashmere sweater rode up just an inch. That was all Aaliyah needed. In that brief second, she saw a dark circular bruise on the underside of the boy's wrist. It was the distinct mark of a thumb and forefinger gripping too hard, a hidden scar of frustration and cruelty. Aaliyah's heart hammered against her ribs, but not from fear. It was the cold, sharp clarity of a woman who had spent years protecting the vulnerable. She didn't respond to the insults about her status or her skin. She didn't argue about the orange juice or the rug. Instead, she leaned in slightly, her eyes boring into Tiffany's with a terrifying intensity that made the socialite's breath catch. "You can call me trash all you want, Tiffany Aaliyah," whispered her voice a low, lethal vibration. "But we both know that the real filth in this room isn't on my apron. It is under your sleeve and in the silence of that little boy." Tiffany's face went from red to a ghostly panicked white as the realization hit her. The maid wasn't just cleaning the house. She was reading the truth written in bruises. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom swung open with a force that made the crystal chandeliers rattle. Caleb Sterling stepped into the room, his presence instantly draining the air from the lungs of everyone present. He was a man built of sharp lines and expensive charcoal wool, a billionaire who commanded markets with a single nod. His eyes, usually as cold and calculating as a high-frequency trading floor, swept over the scene of chaos. He saw the broken glass, the spilled juice, and his sobbing fiancée. He saw the maid standing there, her uniform stained, and her head held high in a way that he immediately misinterpreted as defiance. Caleb did not ask questions. He was a man who lived by results and appearances, and right now the appearance was a disaster. Tiffany wasted no time. She collapsed against his chest, her shoulders shaking with practiced precision. "Oh, Caleb, it was horrible," she sobbed into his lapel, her voice muffled but loud enough for every guest to hear. "I just tried to suggest a better way to organize the nursery, and she went berserk. She started throwing things, and then she hasted this juice at me. She even tried to push Leo." Caleb's jaw tightened until a muscle pulsed in his cheek. He looked down at Leo, who was frozen in fear, then his gaze snapped to Aaliyah. The disgust in his eyes was visceral. It wasn't just anger. It was the deep-seated contempt of a man who believed that poverty was a character flaw. He stepped toward Aaliyah, his shadow looming over her like a dark cloud. "I gave you a chance because I believed in rehabilitation," Caleb said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that carried the weight of a death sentence. "I thought bringing someone from your background into a home like this would inspire you to do better. But I see now that you can take the girl out of the streets, but you can't take the streets out of the girl. You people are all the same. You see a life of luxury, and instead of working for it, you try to tear it down out of spite. You aren't just a bad employee, Aaliyah. You are a predator." Aaliyah felt the sting of his words, more than the slap from Tiffany. It was the casual way he used the phrase, "you people," the way he reduced her entire existence to a stereotype. She looked at this powerful man and realized he was blind. He had all the money in the world, but couldn't see the woman who had spent her last dime on her mother's medicine. He couldn't see the expert who had studied for years to understand the silence of children. He only saw a maid with an attitude. Caleb didn't wait for her to speak. He didn't want her truth. He wanted his order restored. "Get out of my sight," he commanded, pointing a finger toward the hallway. "Go to the servants' quarters and stay there until the police arrive to escort you off my property. I won't have my son's home poisoned by your resentment another minute." Aaliyah didn't say a word. She simply turned her heart breaking for the little boy who was being left alone with two monsters in silk. Aaliyah stood her ground as the heavy silence of the room pressed in on her. She didn't waste her breath pleading for her job or defending her dignity against Caleb's cruel words. Her focus was entirely on the small boy, whose face was turning a ghostly shade of gray. Caleb was already turning away, his hand dismissively waving her out of his sight, but Aaliyah stepped forward, her voice cutting through his arrogance like a surgeon's blade. "Mr. Sterling, look at your son's fingernails," she said, her tone devoid of fear and filled only with clinical urgency. Caleb stopped, his back stiffening, but he didn't turn around yet. Aaliyah continued, her words rapid and precise. "Leo is not just crying, he is experiencing stridor. His breathing is high-pitched because his airway is narrowing. Look at the way his chest is retaking. He is struggling for every breath while you are worried about your reputation." Tiffany let out a sharp, mocking gasp, clutching Caleb's arm tighter. "Caleb, don't listen to this woman," she hissed, her eyes darting nervously toward the child. "She is trying to distract you from what she did. She is making things up to sound smart." But Aaliyah didn't look at Tiffany. She kept her eyes on Caleb's broad shoulders. "Mr. Sterling, you are a man of logic," she said. "Look at the swelling in his lips. That is not from crying. That is an allergic reaction. If you don't give him an epinephrine shot right now, his throat will close completely. I was a licensed speech pathologist before I lost everything. I know what a dying child looks like." Caleb finally turned, but the look in his eyes wasn't one of realization. It was deeper, darker fury. He looked at Leo, who was indeed gasping, but Caleb's mind was so poisoned by Tiffany's lies that he saw the child's distress as a result of Aaliyah's presence. "You are a master of manipulation, aren't you?" Caleb whispered, his voice vibrating with a terrifying coldness. "You think you can use my son's health as a pawn to keep your job? You want to play doctor to hide the fact that you're a thief and a liar." He stepped closer, his shadow engulfing her. "You are the reason he is upset. You are the toxin in this house." He didn't call for a doctor. He didn't check the boy's pulse. Instead, he gripped Aaliyah's arm and dragged her toward the narrow, windowless storage room off the main hallway. "Since you like to cause drama at my parties, you can stay in here and think about your next move while I wait for the authorities," Caleb growled. He shoved her into the darkness of the small room where the only light came from the crack under the door. The heavy lock clicked into place, sealing her in with the scent of floor wax and old coats. Through the thick wood, Aaliyah could hear Leo's ragged, whistling breaths getting weaker. She pounded on the door, her voice raw with desperation. "Caleb, check his pulse. Check the back of his throat. Don't let your pride kill your son." But all she heard was the sound of Caleb's expensive shoes walking away and Tiffany's soft, triumphant laughter fading into the distance. Aaliyah sank to the floor, her heart breaking in the dark, knowing that the only person who could save the boy was locked away like a criminal. The darkness of the storage room was thick and heavy, smelling of old cedar and industrial floor wax, but for Aaliyah it was not a place of defeat. She sat on the cold floor, her back against a stack of winter coats, and closed her eyes. While the elite guests laughed in the ballroom above, her mind began to race through the complex corridors of medical science. She didn't think like a maid in that moment, she thought like the specialist she was trained to be. She whispered the diagnostic criteria under her breath, her voice a rhythmic chant of neuroanatomy and phonology. "Dysphagia level 3, she murmured to the shadows. "Inconsistent vocal fold adduction." The boy is not just choosing to be silent, his brain is struggling to coordinate the very muscles of survival. Aaliyah remembered the thousands of hours she had spent in clinical rotations, the late nights studying for her board exams, and the pride she felt when she received her license as a speech-language pathologist. She was the rising star of her graduating class, the woman who could reach the children that everyone else had given up on. But then, the world had collapsed. Her mother's diagnosis had come like a thief in the night, and the American healthcare system had no mercy for a daughter's devotion. The specialized treatments, the experimental surgeries, the endless rounds of chemotherapy. Aaliyah had cashed out her 401k, sold her car, and eventually watched as the bank took her small condo. When her mother finally passed away, Aaliyah was left with a mountain of medical debt that no therapist's salary could ever climb. The license she worked so hard for, was currently suspended because she couldn't afford the insurance and renewal fees. She had traded her professional blazer for a maid's apron just to keep the debt collectors from the door. But as she sat in the dark, the knowledge remained sharp and lethal. She visualized the anatomy of Leo's throat. She remembered the specific tilt of his head when he tried to swallow, and the way his eyes darted when he heard a sudden noise. It wasn't just an allergy, it was a sensory processing disorder, compounded by a trauma-induced blockage. Caleb Sterling thought he had locked away a clumsy servant, but he had actually imprisoned the only person in New York City who truly understood the architecture of his son's silence. Aaliyah pressed her ear to the cold wood of the door, listening for any sign of life from the hallway. Every second that passed was a second Leo's airway could be closing. She didn't care about the humiliation or the ruined uniform anymore. She was a healer in a house of stone, and she would break her own hands to get through that door if it meant saving a child who shared the same storm-gray eyes that haunted her dreams. The millionaire's money couldn't buy this expertise, and Tiffany's lies couldn't erase it. Aaliyah took a deep breath, centering herself for the battle ahead. The darkness was just a temporary silence, and she was the queen of making the silence speak. Aaliyah pressed her eye to the narrow crack of the storage room door, her breath hitching in her throat as she watched the scene unfold in the dimly lit hallway. The grandeur of the Sterling mansion felt suffocating, a gilded cage, where the most dangerous predators wore silk and diamonds. Caleb's heavy footsteps had finally faded toward the west wing, leaving a heavy, expectant silence behind. Tiffany Montgomery stood over little Leo, her shadow stretching long and jagged across the marble floor like a dark omen. The moment she was sure Caleb was out of earshot, the mask of the doting stepmother didn't just slip, it shattered. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, cold resentment. Leo was trembling so hard his teeth were chattering, his small hands balled into tight fists at his sides. He looked up at Tiffany with eyes wide with a terror that no 3-year-old should ever know. Tiffany didn't offer a hand of comfort. Instead, she leaned down her expensive perfume, probably choking the boy as she moved in close. Aaliyah watched in horror as Tiffany reached out not to brush away a tear, but to grab the boy's ear. She didn't just pull it. She pinched the delicate skin between her sharp manicured nails and twisted with a calculated cruelty. Leo's body jolted, his face turning a deep, painful red as he fought to keep his silent scream behind his teeth. He knew the rules of this house better than anyone. "You pathetic little brat," Tiffany hissed, her voice a low, lethal vibration that sent shivers down Aaliyah's spine. "You think your silence makes you special? It makes you a burden. You are nothing but a broken toy that your father is too proud to throw away. If you ever make a sound like that again, if you ever try to draw his attention while I am talking, I will make sure you never see the light of day again. Do you understand me?" She twisted harder, and Aaliyah could see a small bead of blood forming where Tiffany's nail pierced the skin. Leo nodded frantically, his eyes darting toward the floor, completely broken. Aaliyah's grip tightened on the door handle until her knuckles turned white. Every instinct she had as a healer and a mother was screaming at her to burst through the door and tear that woman away from the child. But she knew that if she moved now, she would be arrested before the truth could ever come out. She had to be the witness. She had to be the one who recorded every twitch of Tiffany's cruelty and every silent plea in Leo's eyes. Tiffany stood up, smoothing her designer dress, as if she hadn't just tortured a toddler. She checked her reflection in a nearby mirror, a cold, satisfied smile touching her lips. To the world, she was the savior of the Sterling family, the woman bringing order to a chaotic home. But through that sliver of light in the dark room, Aaliyah saw the truth. Tiffany Montgomery was a monster, and the billionaire was leaving his only son in the hands of a butcher. Aaliyah whispered a silent promise into the darkness of the closet. "I see you, Leo. I see everything, and I am coming for her." The tension in the grand hall was thick enough to suffocate as Caleb Sterling dipped his gold-plated pen toward the marriage contract that would bind his empire to the Montgomery family. But just as the nib touched the paper, a sound broke the silence that made everyone's blood run cold. It was a low, rhythmic moaning coming from the corner of the room where little Leo sat. The boy was rocking back and forth, his eyes glazed over, and his small hands began to thrum against his ears. This was not a tantrum, it was a full-scale sensory meltdown. The flashing cameras of the press and the high-pitched chatter of the socialites had finally pushed his fragile nervous system over the edge. Caleb froze his eyes, darting toward his son with a mixture of confusion and embarrassment. He wanted to reach out, but he didn't know how to bridge the gap between his world of numbers and his son's world of shadows. Tiffany saw the cameras turning toward the struggling child, and her face hardened behind her practiced smile. She knew that a sobbing child would ruin the perfect image of the sterling family she had worked so hard to build. She stepped toward Leo, her heels clicking like a countdown on the marble floor. "Come on, Leo, be a big boy for the cameras," she whispered, her voice sugary sweet for the audience, but cold as ice for the child. But Leo didn't hear her. He was trapped in a storm of noise and light. He began to let out a shrill, piercing scream that echoed off the high ceilings. The guests began to whisper, and Tiffany felt the eyes of New York's elite judging her ability to control the future heir. Her patience snapped like a dry twig. She leaned down as if to give the boy a hug, but as her body shielded him from the view of the crowd, she reached out and gripped his shoulder with a terrifying strength. Her sharp nails dug deep into the boy's tender skin through his expensive wool sweater. "Shut up right now, you little monster!" she hissed directly into his ear, her breath hot and angry. "If you don't stop this screaming, I will make sure you never see that maid again. I will lock you in the dark, and no one will hear you cry." She increased the pressure, twisting her fingers until the boy's face turned a deep shade of purple. Leo's scream didn't stop, it changed. It became a sound of pure agony, a desperate plea for help that no one in the room seemed to understand except for one woman standing in the shadows of the hallway. Tiffany didn't stop there. Under the cover of her long silk dress, she used her knee to pin the boy against the heavy mahogany chair, trying to force the air out of his lungs to stop the noise. She was smiling at the photographers over her shoulder, while her hidden hand was preparing to strike the boy across the back of his head. She was a master of the hidden bruise, the silent strike that left no evidence for a father who was too busy looking at contracts to look at his son. Aaliyah watched from the dark, her heart shattering as she recognized the signs of a child being broken in plain sight. She knew that if she didn't act now, the boy's voice would be lost forever. The billionaire was signing away his life while his son was fighting for his, and the only person who cared was the woman they had just called trash. The security guards reached for Aaliyah's arms, their heavy-gloved hands ready to drag her out of the only place where she could protect the innocent. Tiffany stood there with a triumphant smirk, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of victory as she watched the maid being discarded like yesterday's trash. Caleb turned his back, his heart hardened by the lies he had been fed, believing that removing Aaliyah would bring peace to his fractured home. But as Aaliyah was forced toward the grand mahogany doors, she looked back one last time. Her eyes didn't seek mercy from Caleb or show hatred for Tiffany. They were locked on Leo. She saw the boy standing in the center of the vast, empty hall, his small body racking with tremors that no child should ever endure. He looked at the guards, then at the door, then back at the only person who had ever looked at him with true understanding. The silence that had defined the sterling penthouse for 3 long years began to vibrate with a terrifying pressure. It was the sound of a dam about to burst, the sound of a soul reclaiming its power. Just as the guards reached the threshold, Leo's mouth opened. It wasn't a sob, it wasn't a whimper, it was a raw, jagged sound that tore through the polished air of the Manhattan elite. "Mommy!" he screamed, his voice cracking with the strain of years of silence. The word hit Caleb like a physical blow, making him spin around so fast he nearly lost his balance. The guards froze their grip, loosening on Aaliyah's shoulders. The socialites in the room dropped their glasses, the sound of shattering crystal punctuating the miraculous moment. Leo's legs moved, and he began to run. He didn't run to his father. He didn't run to the woman who was about to become his stepmother. He threw himself at Aaliyah, his small arms wrapping around her waist with a strength born of pure desperation. "Mommy, don't let her hurt me again," he wailed, his face buried in the starch of her stained apron. "Please don't let the mean lady take me back to the dark room." Everyone in the room stood paralyzed. The phrase "hurt me again" hung in the air like a poisonous cloud exposing the rot hidden beneath the sterling gold. Tiffany's face went from pale to a ghostly translucent gray as she realized the boy she had spent years silencing had just become her judge, jury, and executioner. Aaliyah dropped to her knees, ignoring the guards and the billionaires and the cameras. She pulled Leo into her chest, her tears finally falling as she felt the frantic heartbeat of the child against her own. "I am here, Leo. I am right here," she whispered, her voice carrying a strength that filled every corner of the room. "I will never let her touch you again. I promise on my life." Caleb moved toward them, his hands shaking as he looked from his son to the woman he had just called a predator. He saw the way Leo clung to Aaliyah as if she were the only oxygen in a room full of smoke. He saw the terror in his son's eyes when Tiffany tried to step forward. For the first time in his life, the billionaire was forced to face the fact that his money had bought him a house, but his blindness had almost cost him his son's soul. The silence was over, and the truth was just beginning to scream. The dead silence that followed Leo's words was more deafening than any explosion. It was a thick, suffocating vacuum that seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the room. Caleb Sterling's hand went limp, and the heavy leather-bound folder containing the merger and marriage contracts slipped from his fingers, hitting the marble floor with a dull, hollow thud. The papers scattered like fallen leaves, but no one moved to pick them up. Every eye in the ballroom was fixed on the small boy, clinging to the maid's stained apron. Caleb felt a cold sweat break out across his neck as the words, "Mommy and hurt me again," looped in his mind like a broken record. His son, who had been a ghost in his own home for 3 years, had just shattered the world with a single sentence. Tiffany Montgomery was the first to break the paralysis, but her reaction was not one of comfort. Her face went from a ghostly white to a mottled, panicked red. She took a sharp, stumbling step back, as if Leo's voice had been a physical blow to her chest. "This is a trick," she shrieked, her voice cracking and hitting a pitch that set everyone's nerves on edge. "Caleb, don't you see what is happening? This woman has done something to him. She is using some kind of street magic or voodoo to brainwash a helpless child." Tiffany's hands were shaking so violently that her diamond rings clattered against each other. She pointed a trembling finger at Aaliyah, her eyes bulging with a desperate, animalistic fear. "She must have drugged him." Tiffany continued to yell, her words coming out in a frantic rush as she tried to reclaim the narrative. "I saw her whispering to him in the dark. She probably gave him some kind of hallucinogen from the slums to make him say those things. Look at him, he is not himself. She is trying to destroy us, Caleb. She is trying to steal our future by poisoning the mind of your son." Tiffany's accusations grew more wild and nonsensical as she realized the gravity of what Leo had revealed. She scrambled toward Caleb, clutching at his arm with her sharp nails, but he remained as motionless as a statue, his gaze locked on the way Leo was hiding his face in Aaliyah's neck. Aaliyah didn't look at Tiffany once. She didn't argue or defend herself against the ridiculous claims of magic and drugs. She simply tightened her hold on Leo, feeling the frantic rhythm of his heart slowing down as he found safety in her arms. The guests began to murmur, the sound rising from a low hum to a roar of speculation. They weren't looking at the billionaire's wealth anymore. They were looking at the sheer terror in a child's eyes when his future stepmother moved closer. The shockwave had moved beyond the room and was now tearing through the very foundation of the Sterling legacy. Caleb finally looked up, his eyes, no longer cold, but filled with a terrifying crystalline clarity. He looked at Tiffany not as his bride, but as a stranger he was seeing for the very first time. The silence was gone, but the storm was just beginning to howl. Tiffany's face transformed into a jagged mask of terror as the word "mommy" echoed through the gilded ballroom. She could feel the judging eyes of Manhattan's elite burning into her skin, and she knew that her carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble. In a desperate attempt to reclaim control, she did the unthinkable. She lunged toward Leo, her hand flying through the air with the speed of a striking viper. The crack of her palm hitting the boy's tender cheek was so loud it seemed to stop the very hearts of everyone watching. "Shut up!" she screamed, her voice hitting a frequency of pure madness. "You don't know what you are saying. This woman has poisoned your brain with her lies." Leo's head snapped to the side and a small cry of pain escaped his throat as he buried his face deeper into Aaliyah's apron. But for the first time in 3 years, the silence that followed was not one of submission. It was the silence of a man waking up from a long and expensive dream. Caleb Sterling moved before Tiffany could raise her hand a second time. His large hand shot out, catching Tiffany's wrist in mid-air with a grip that made her diamonds creak. His face was a map of cold fury and dawning realization. "That is enough," Caleb said, his voice a low vibrating rumble that carried more weight than any shout. Tiffany struggled against his grip, her eyes wide and frantic. "Caleb, let me go. The boy is having a psychotic break. He is hallucinating because of that maid. We need to get him to a hospital and get her to a jail cell." But Caleb didn't let go. He looked down at his son, seeing for the first time the way Leo was shaking, not just from the allergy or the noise, but from the sheer presence of the woman who was supposed to be his new mother. Caleb looked at the red welt blooming on Leo's face, then back at Tiffany's twisted expression. The disbelief he had felt toward Aaliyah began to shift and turn into a bitter seed of doubt. "You just struck my son in front of a room full of people," Caleb whispered, his voice filled with a terrifying clarity. "You didn't check if he was breathing. You didn't ask why he spoke for the first time in years. Your first instinct was to silence him." Tiffany tried to soften her gaze to bring back the tears of the victim, but the mask was broken. Caleb felt the coldness of her skin and remembered every time she had told him that Leo was better off in his room, or that the boy was too tired to see his father. The tiny details began to click together like the tumblers of a safe. The hidden bruises, the way Leo always flinched when she entered a room, the unwavering dignity of the maid who had risked everything just to tell him his son was in danger. Tiffany let out a small whimper of fear as she saw the reflection of her own soul in Caleb's eyes. "Caleb, please, I was just stressed. I was trying to protect our reputation," she pleaded. But Caleb simply pushed her hand away with a gesture of pure disgust. "My son's voice is worth more than every reputation in this city," he said. He turned to Aaliyah, his eyes searching hers for the truth he had been too proud to see. "Take him to the study," Caleb commanded. "No one enters except the doctor. And Tiffany, you stay exactly where you are." The seeds of suspicion had finally broken through the surface, and the billionaire was about to dig until he found the rot at the core of his house. Caleb Sterling stood like a statue in the center of the room, surrounded by guests who were whispering and gossiping, feeling the weight of 1,000 eyes pressing down on him. The recent chaos had tarnished the perfect image he had spent his entire life building. Although the seeds of doubt had begun to sprout in his heart, a billionaire's instinct always prioritized controlling the situation before facing the truth. He looked at Aaliyah, who was kneeling on the floor holding Leo tightly, and a strange sense of guilt rose within him, but he quickly brushed it aside with his usual cold exterior. "You need to leave immediately," Caleb said, his voice hardening like the sound of steel striking steel. "I do not care what Leo just said or what you have done to enchant him, but your presence here is an insult to this family. You have caused enough trouble for one night." Tiffany stood beside him, trying to squeeze out a triumphant smile, even though her hands were still shaking with fear. "That is right. Caleb, kick her out. She is the root of all this madness," Tiffany added, her voice a sharp hiss of malice. Caleb did not look at Tiffany. He simply signaled to the security guards waiting at the door. "Take her out of here through the back entrance, and ensure she does not take anything that belongs to the Sterling estate. Aaliyah stood up slowly and with great pride. She did not look at Caleb to beg for mercy. She simply leaned down to kiss Leo's forehead and whispered something that made the child let go of her hands. As she walked away, her silhouette was thin, but incredibly steady in the white apron that had been stained with orange juice and the grime of humiliation. The sound of her shoes echoed steadily on the marble floor, sounding like the rhythmic countdown of a pending sentence. Caleb stood still, watching her back. He told himself he was doing the right thing to protect the reputation of his lineage, but his eyes could not pull away from her old and tattered apron. In Caleb's mind, a fierce battle was raging. He saw the contrast between Tiffany's fake luxury and the heartbreaking sincerity of the maid he had just dismissed. That apron was not just a symbol of poverty, it was evidence of a person who had truly touched his son's pain. As the grand doors closed, separating Aaliyah from his world, Caleb felt a strange emptiness spreading through his chest. He had kicked out the only person who had made his son speak after 3 long years. He had saved face in front of the New York elite, but in his heart, he knew he had just lost something more valuable than diamonds. His gaze remained fixed on the door where Aaliyah's shadow had just vanished, and a cold question arose in his mind. If she was right, then he was the true monster in this story. A cold wind blew in from the window, but it was not as cold as the truth that was beginning to freeze the billionaire's heart. The penthouse was silent, but the air inside Caleb Sterling's master suite felt heavy and suffocating. He lay on his silk sheets staring at the ceiling as the glowing lights of the Manhattan skyline filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard it again, the raw, jagged sound of his son's voice. "Mommy." The word was a ghost that haunted the room. He turned over and his hand brushed against the small wooden toy boat that Aaliyah had handed him before she was dragged away. It was a simple thing, weathered and smooth, but it felt like a lead weight in his palm. Caleb sat up, the cold air of the room biting at his skin. He remembered the look in Aaliyah's eyes. It wasn't the look of a criminal or a predator. It was the look of a soldier who had stayed behind to hold the line. He turned the wooden boat over in his hands, his fingers tracing the fine seams of the craftsmanship. He noticed a small, unnatural indentation near the hull. His heart began to beat in a slow, heavy rhythm. Caleb was a man who's built empires by noticing the things others missed, and right now his intuition was screaming. He grabbed a small silver letter opener from his bedside table and carefully pried at the wood. The panel popped open with a soft click, revealing a hollow chamber. Tucked inside was not a bribe or a threat, but a tiny professional-grade digital recorder. It was smaller than a coin, but it felt like a bomb ready to detonate. Caleb's breath hitched. He realized that Aaliyah hadn't just been a maid. She had been an investigator. She had been a witness. His fingers trembled as he pressed the play button. The recording was crystal clear. At first, there was only the sound of Leo's soft, rhythmic breathing. Then a door creaked open. The sound of high heels clicking on marble, sharp and aggressive. Tiffany's voice came through the speakers, but it wasn't the sweet, melodic tone she used at the charity galas. It was a distorted snarl. "You little freak," Tiffany hissed, followed by the sound of a sharp slap. "Do you think your father actually loves you? He only keeps you around because he is too ashamed to admit he failed." The recording captured Leo's tiny gasp for air, and then the sound of his head hitting the headboard. "Stop crying, or I will give you something real to cry about." Caleb felt the blood drain from his face. The coldness that started in his chest spread to his limbs until he felt like he was made of ice. He listened as the recording went on for over an hour. It was a diary of systematic torture. He heard Tiffany laughing as she told Leo that his mother had died because she didn't want a broken son. He heard the sound of her pinching him and the whispered threats that she would kill his favorite pets if he ever looked at his father the wrong way. Caleb stood up, his body shaking with a rage so profound it felt like it would tear his soul apart. He looked at the marriage contract sitting on his desk, the paper that represented the union of two of the most powerful families in New York, and he realized he had been sleeping next to a monster. He looked at the wooden boat, and then at the dark hallway leading to Leo's room. Aaliyah Jordan hadn't tried to destroy his life. She had been the only one trying to save it. Caleb grabbed his phone, his eyes burning with a lethal fire. The billionaire was gone. The father had finally woken up. Caleb Sterling sat on the edge of his bed, the silence of the room ringing in his ears as he pressed the play button on the tiny device. The first few seconds were just white noise, the sound of a luxury apartment breathing, but then the audio sharpened. He heard the heavy click of heels on marble, and his heart began to throb in his throat. Tiffany's voice came through the speaker, but it was not the soft melodic tone he had fallen in love with. It was a jagged glass shards of a voice filled with a hatred so pure it felt like a physical weight in the air. "You useless little parasite," Tiffany spat, followed by a sound that made Caleb's stomach flip, a sharp, wet smack of skin against skin. The recording captured Leo's tiny, terrified gasp. He wasn't crying, he was choking on his own fear. Tiffany didn't stop. "Do you think your father actually wants you?" She hissed, her words dripping with a venomous cruelty. "He looks at you and all he sees is a mistake. He looks at you and sees the reason your mother is gone. You are a broken toy. Leo and I am the only one who knows how to handle garbage." Caleb felt the blood drain from his face until his skin felt like cold paper. He listened as Tiffany laughed, a low, mocking sound, while the boy whimpered in the background. She was describing the ways she would hurt him if he ever tried to speak to his father, the way she would make sure he was sent away to a place where no one would ever find him. As the recording continued, Caleb realized he had been living with a monster disguised in silk and diamonds. He heard her bragging to someone on the phone about how easy it was to manipulate him. She called him a blind fool who was too busy making millions to notice his own son was being broken right under his nose. She laughed about the bruises she hid under the boy's expensive sweaters and how she had convinced Caleb that the maid was the enemy. Every word was a needle to Caleb's soul. He remembered the times he had ignored Leo's flinching, the times he had taken Tiffany's side, and the brutal way he had dismissed Aaliyah for trying to tell him the truth. The recording ended with the sound of a door slamming and Leo's soft rhythmic rocking against the floor. Caleb dropped the recorder and it skittered across the polished wood. He felt a rage so profound and so dark that it threatened to consume him. This woman had sat at his table, kissed his cheek, and planned a future with him, while she was systematically destroying the only thing that truly mattered to him. He looked at his own hands and felt a wave of self-loathing. He had prided himself on being a man who could see through any deception, yet he had been the biggest victim of them all. The perfect fiancé was a myth, and the maid he had called trash was the only hero in this house. Caleb stood up, his eyes burning with a lethal coldness. He didn't need any more evidence. The billionaire was gone and the father was ready for war. Tiffany Montgomery thought she was marrying into an empire, but she had just signed her own destruction. Caleb grabbed his phone, his voice a low, dangerous growl as he made the first of many calls that would tear her world apart. The tires of Caleb Sterling's black SUV screamed against the frozen asphalt as he tore through the gridlocked streets of Manhattan. The luxury and warmth of his penthouse were miles behind him, but the chilling sounds of the recording were still echoing in his ears. He didn't care about the red lights or the black ice forming on the bridges. He didn't care that his expensive tires were losing grip on the slushy roads of the Bronx. All he could see was Aaliyah's face when he had called her a predator. All he could feel was the weight of the tiny recorder in his pocket, a device that had just dismantled his entire reality. The snow was falling in thick, blinding sheets, turning the world into a white void. But Caleb drove with a desperation that bordered on madness. He had to find her. He had to find the only woman who had truly loved his son while he was busy building a throne of lies. He reached the address he had pulled from the agency's old files, a crumbling tenement building, where the heat was a luxury and the hallways smelled of damp concrete and broken dreams. Caleb stepped out of his car, the biting New York wind tearing at his tailored coat, but he didn't feel the cold. He only felt the burning shame of a man who had realized he had been a king in a house of glass. He climbed the stairs 3 at a time, his heavy boots thundering on the rusted metal. He reached the 4th floor gasping for air and pounded on the door of apartment 4B. "Aaliyah." He roared, his voice raw and cracked with an emotion he hadn't felt in decades. "Aaliyah, please open the door." The door didn't open. Instead, a neighbor, a woman with tired eyes and a thick coat, peeked out from across the hall. "If you're looking for the girl who lived there, she's gone," the woman said, her voice flat with the exhaustion of the city. "She came home crying hours ago, packed her life into 2 suitcases and left. She said she couldn't stay in a city that treated her like trash after she gave them her soul." Caleb felt the floor shift beneath him. Gone where? He grabbed the doorframe, his knuckles white. The neighbor shrugged. "She mentioned the bus station, said something about going back south where people still have a heart." Caleb didn't wait for another word. He turned and sprinted back down the stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He realized he had been a billionaire who owned the skyline, but he was about to lose the only person who actually mattered. He jumped back into his car, the engine roaring to life as he headed toward Port Authority. The snow was getting heavier, but his resolve was hardening into steel. He had spent his life chasing profit and power, but now he was chasing something far more valuable. He was chasing redemption. He was chasing the mother of his son. He wouldn't stop until he found her and begged for a forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. The hunt for the truth was over, and the hunt for his family had just begun. Caleb Sterling stood in the dim light of a local library, in the heart of a neighborhood he had only ever seen from the tinted windows of a limousine. The air smelled of old paper and hope, a sharp contrast to the cold, sterile scent of his own empire. He found Aaliyah sitting in a circle of children, her voice soft but commanding, as she guided them through the complex sounds of a language they were just beginning to master. She didn't look like a maid anymore. She looked like a queen in her own kingdom. Caleb waited by the entrance, his heart pounding against his ribs, until the last child had left. When Aaliyah finally looked up and saw him, she didn't smile. She didn't look afraid. She simply stood up and wiped the chalk dust from her hands with a dignity that made Caleb feel small. "I have been looking for you everywhere," Caleb said, his voice cracking with the weight of the secrets he was carrying. He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick envelope stuffed with $100 bills. "This is for everything. For the way I treated you, for the lies Tiffany told, and for saving my son. It is a drop in the bucket compared to what I owe you, but it is a start." He held the money out to her, expecting her to take it with the desperation he assumed everyone in this part of town felt. But Aaliyah didn't even glance at the envelope. She kept her eyes locked on his, and the fire in them was enough to burn through his pride. "Keep your money, Mr. Sterling," Aaliyah said, her voice cold and steady. "You think you can just write a check and erase the fact that you threw me out like trash while your son was dying? You think you can buy the soul of a woman who stood between your child and a monster? I didn't save Leo for a reward. I saved him because he is a human being, and he deserved a voice. I don't want your charity, and I don't want your pity." Caleb blinked in shock, his hand still extended with the useless paper. He had never met someone who didn't have a price. Aaliyah walked over to a shelf and picked up a worn textbook. "Come with me," she commanded. She led him through the stacks to a small corner where a group of teenagers were studying intently. "These children are here because the system forgot them," Aaliyah whispered as they watched. "I teach them here for free because I know what it's like to be silenced. I was a specialist, a woman with a career and a future, until the debt from my mother's cancer took everything I owned. I became your maid because I had to survive, but I never stopped being a teacher." Caleb looked around at the peeling paint and the donated chairs, and then back at the woman who had lost everything but her integrity. He realized that while he had been counting his billions, she had been counting the lives she could save. He put the money back in his pocket, feeling a deep sense of shame. He didn't just need to apologize, he needed to learn how to be a man worthy of the truth she had given him. Caleb placed the envelope of money back into his coat pocket, feeling the weight of his own ignorance settling in his chest. He had come here thinking that money could fix a broken apology, that a check could smooth over the cracks in a woman's dignity. But standing in the quiet hum of the community library, surrounded by worn books and the scent of old paper, he realized that Aaliyah Jordan was operating on a currency he had long forgotten. It was the currency of truth. Aaliyah did not ask him to leave again. Instead, she took a step closer, her face illuminated by the flickering fluorescent light overhead. She studied his face with a clinical intensity that made Caleb feel like he was the one being examined under a microscope. "You call yourself a man of details," Mr. Sterling, Aaliyah said softly, her voice devoid of the anger he expected. "You built an empire by spotting the flaws in contracts and the hidden value in properties. But you missed the most obvious detail in your own home. You missed the one thing that screams the truth every time your son looks at you." Caleb frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. "I don't understand what you are talking about. I know I missed the signs of abuse. I know I failed to protect him from Tiffany." Aaliyah shook her head slowly, cutting him off. "No, Caleb. I am not talking about the bruises. I am talking about the blood." She took a deep breath, as if preparing to drop a bomb that would destroy the last remnants of his world. "Tell me, Caleb, what color are Leo's eyes?" Caleb blinked, surprised by the question. "They are gray," he answered automatically. "A deep storm gray. Everyone comments on them. They are unique." Aaliyah nodded, her expression unreadable. "Exactly. Storm gray. A color so rare it is practically a genetic signature." "Now tell me, what color are Tiffany's eyes?" Caleb paused, visualizing the woman he had almost married. "Green. Bright emerald green. And yours?" Aaliyah asked, pointing to his own face. "Mine are dark brown," Caleb said, his voice trailing off as the gears in his mind began to turn. Aaliyah took another step forward, closing the distance between them until he could see the flecks of gold in her irises. She leaned in, and for the first time Caleb really looked at her. He didn't see the maid or the teacher. He saw a pair of eyes that were identical to the ones that looked up at him from the crib every night. They were not brown. In the dim light they had looked dark, but here, under the library lamps, they were a piercing, unmistakable storm gray, the exact same shade as Leo's. The realization hit Caleb like a physical blow to the gut, knocking the wind out of him. "You and Tiffany do not carry that gene," Aaliyah whispered, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of the secret she had kept buried. "Two parents with brown and green eyes do not produce a child with eyes the color of a winter hurricane. That is a dominant trait. It has to come from a direct bloodline." Caleb felt the room spin. He grabbed the edge of a bookshelf to steady himself. He thought about the fertility clinic 4 years ago. He thought about Tiffany's claims that the extraction process had been difficult, that she had sacrificed her body to give him an heir. But looking into Aaliyah's eyes, he saw a mirror image of his son. The math didn't add up. The biology didn't add up. And suddenly the billionaire realized that the fraud Tiffany Montgomery had committed wasn't just about money or status. It was about life itself. "Who are you?" Caleb whispered, his voice hoarse with shock. Aaliyah didn't look away. "I am the woman who needed to pay for her mother's chemotherapy," she said simply. "And you are the man who bought a lie wrapped in a designer dress." Caleb sat in the back of his limousine with his laptop glowing in the darkness like a portal to the past. He didn't go home. He couldn't face the lies in that penthouse until he armed himself with the cold, hard evidence. He dialed the private number of the director of the Genesis Fertility Center, a man whose entire career had been funded by the Sterling Family Trust. "Wake up, Dr. Eris," Caleb commanded, his voice tight with controlled rage. "I want the raw data from my son's conception file, not the summary you gave me 4 years ago. I want the donor intake forms and the financial ledgers from that specific week." The doctor hesitated, stammering about privacy laws and closed archives, but Caleb cut him off. "You have 5 minutes to send those files, or I will buy your clinic tomorrow morning and burn it to the ground." The files arrived with a digital ping that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet car. Caleb opened the folder labeled Sterling Heir. He scrolled past the glossy brochure photos of Tiffany signing papers and went straight to the medical metadata. There it was. The anomaly he had been too blind to see. Tiffany's medical chart showed a note from a gynecologist dated 6 years ago, confirming she had undergone a procedure that made natural conception impossible. She couldn't produce eggs. She never could. The entire pregnancy story, the morning sickness she faked for months, and the tears of joy were all a performance worthy of an Academy Award. She had played the role of the glowing mother while secretly shopping for genetic material like she was buying a handbag. Caleb scrolled down to the subfolder marked Biological Source Material. He opened the profile for donor 892. A scanned photograph filled the screen. It was younger and the face was rounder, but it was unmistakably her. Aaliyah Jordan, 25 years old, graduate student. The reason for donation was listed in stark bureaucratic font fast cash for emergency oncology treatment for mother. Caleb felt his heart stop. He read the financial agreement. Tiffany had paid a premium for a rush order, specifically requesting a donor with high intelligence and specific physical markers, but she had requested the donor's identity be permanently sealed. Tiffany had essentially purchased a child from a woman who was selling a piece of herself to save her dying mother. Caleb looked at the date of the transaction. It was the same week Tiffany had told him she was pregnant with a miracle baby. She had orchestrated a biological theft. She had used a poor black woman's desperation to secure her place in the Sterling dynasty. And then, when fate brought that woman back into their lives as a maid, Tiffany had tried to destroy her, to keep the secret buried. Caleb slammed the laptop shut, his hands shaking with a mixture of grief and fury. He wasn't just a father who had been lied to, he was a man who had been an accessory to the theft of a human life. The storm-gray eyes made sense now. They weren't just a genetic quirk, they were a beacon of truth that had survived despite every lie Tiffany had told. Caleb signaled the driver to turn around. "Take me home," he said, his voice deadly calm. "I have a wedding to cancel and a monster to evict." The glow of the laptop screen cast a harsh blue light on Caleb's face as he sat in the back of the speeding limousine. He was staring at a document that should have been sealed forever, a digital ghost that Tiffany believed money had buried. It was the donor intake form from the Genesis Fertility Center dated 4 years ago. But it wasn't the medical data that made Caleb's hands shake, it was the handwritten note in the section marked Donor Motivation. In a neat, cramped script that betrayed a trembling hand, Aaliyah had written just one sentence. "I am selling the possibility of my own future to buy my mother one more month of life." Caleb felt a physical ache in his chest as he cross-referenced the financial logs. The payment for the egg donation hadn't gone to a student loan or a vacation fund or a new car. The wire transfer was routed directly to the accounts receivable department of Mount Sinai Oncology. Aaliyah hadn't given up her child because she didn't want him. She had sacrificed her biological legacy to pay for chemotherapy for a dying woman. She had traded the son she would never know for the mother she couldn't bear to lose. The sheer magnitude of that sacrifice made the air in the luxury car feel thin and insufficient. He scrolled further down to the genetic profile. The blood type match was perfect. The physical markers were identical. But it was the final confirmation that shattered Caleb completely. There on page 12 was a waiver Aaliyah had signed. It stated that she understood any child resulting from this procedure would belong solely to the recipient. Caleb laughed, a bitter hollow sound that frightened the driver. Belonged to the recipient. The irony was so sharp it cut like a knife. Tiffany had bought Leo like he was a custom-order handbag, a prop to secure her status as a wife and mother. But Aaliyah was the one who had bled for him. Leo was not a Sterling by blood, and he was certainly not a Montgomery. He was the son of Aaliyah Jordan. The storm-gray eyes were not a random mutation, they were her eyes. The connection that Caleb had dismissed as a maid's trickery was actually the most powerful force in nature, the biological pull between a mother and her child. Leo hadn't cried out for a stranger in that ballroom. His soul had recognized the woman who gave him life, even if his memory could not. The boy knew what the billionaire had been too blind to see. Caleb closed the laptop with a heavy finality. The image of Aaliyah being dragged out of his house accused of being a gold digger and a thief burned in his mind. She wasn't a thief. She was the rightful owner of the most precious thing in that penthouse. And he had treated her like garbage. The debt she had paid to the hospital was gone, but the debt Caleb owed her now was insurmountable. He tapped on the partition glass, his voice low and vibrating with a terrifying resolve. "Drive faster," he commanded. "I am not going home to a fiancé. I am going home to return a son to his mother." The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, delivering Caleb back into the sterile luxury of the penthouse. The air inside smelled of white lilies and expensive champagne, a scent that now made his stomach turn. Tiffany was lounging on the velvet sofa, scrolling through her phone with a glass of wine in her hand, as if she hadn't just been exposed as an abuser an hour ago. When she saw Caleb, she didn't rush over with concern. She simply arched a perfectly sculpted eyebrow and took a slow sip of her drink, waiting for him to beg for her forgiveness. Caleb forced his facial muscles into a mask of exhaustion and resignation. He had to play the role of the overwhelmed billionaire one last time. He walked over to the wet bar and poured himself a drink, his back to her, so she wouldn't see the lethal coldness in his eyes. "I handled it," Caleb said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "The maid is gone. The agency has been notified. The problem has been removed." Tiffany let out a sigh of relief that sounded more like a hiss. Finally, she said, setting her glass down, "I told you she was trouble, Caleb. I told you she was poisoning Leo's mind against me. I am just glad you finally came to your senses before she ruined our wedding." She stood up and walked toward him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Her touch felt like a brand, but Caleb didn't flinch. He turned around, sliding a thick legal document from his inside jacket pocket onto the marble counter. "We need to make sure this never happens again," Caleb said, tapping the paper. "I realized that forcing you to be a mother to a child with such severe needs was unfair to you. You are a Montgomery. You shouldn't be burdened with therapists and meltdowns." Tiffany looked at the document, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What is this?" she asked. "It is an amendment to our prenuptial agreement," Caleb lied smoothly. "It states that you voluntarily relinquish all legal guardianship and decision-making rights regarding Leo. In exchange, you are absolved of any responsibility for his care. You will never have to be alone with him. You will never have to take him to appointments. He will be my burden and mine alone." Tiffany's eyes lit up with a greed that was terrifying to behold. She didn't read the fine print. She didn't ask about the boy's well-being. She only heard that she would be free of the child she despised. "You mean I don't have to pretend anymore?" she asked, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "I don't have to deal with his staring and his noise." Caleb nodded, his heart pounding a slow rhythm of rage. "Sign it, and he is effectively invisible to you." Tiffany laughed, a light tinkling sound that echoed in the silent room. She grabbed the gold pen from Caleb's hand and scribbled her signature with a flourish. "I never wanted a damaged child anyway," she said, capping the pen. "I am doing this for us, Caleb. We can finally have the life we deserve without that anchor dragging us down." Caleb took the paper back, blowing on the wet ink. He looked at her signature. It wasn't just a legal agreement, it was a confession. It was the final nail in her coffin. She had just legally severed herself from the sterling heir, and in doing so, she had stripped herself of the only protection she had against the storm that was about to hit. Caleb folded the document and placed it next to his heart. "Thank you, Tiffany," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You have no idea how much easier you just made this." The ink on the document was barely dry when the atmosphere in the penthouse shifted from cold calculation to suffocating dread. Caleb picked up the paper and folded it with a deliberate slowness that made Tiffany pause mid-sip of her vintage Pinot Noir. She watched him, expecting him to pour a celebratory drink or perhaps discuss the seating arrangements for the gala, but instead he walked over to the fireplace. He didn't burn the paper, he placed it inside his jacket pocket, right next to his heart. "The wedding is off, Tiffany," Caleb said, his voice stripping away the last layers of his performance. You have 5 minutes to gather your things and get out of my building before I have security throw you out on the street like the criminal you are." Tiffany froze the glass halfway to her lips. She blinked once, then twice, a slow smile spreading across her face that didn't reach her eyes. It was the smile of a predator who realized the prey had developed teeth, but she wasn't afraid. She set the glass down on the marble coaster with a sharp click. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice calm and terrifyingly reasonable. "You think because you tricked me into signing a piece of paper that you have won? You think you can just discard a Montgomery like last season's fashion?" She stood up, smoothing the silk of her dress, and walked toward him. "You seem to forget who I am, Caleb. I am not some desperate maid you can pay off or intimidate. I am the face of the merger that is keeping your company's stock price from plummeting. My father's investors are the only reason the Sterling Tower was even finished. If you call off this wedding, I will destroy you." Tiffany circled him, her perfume cloying and sweet. "I will go to the press tomorrow morning. I will tell them that you are mentally unstable. I will tell them that you are unfit to raise a special needs child, and that I was the only thing holding your fractured family together. I will paint you as a monster, Caleb, and by the time the market closes, your stock will be worth less than the paper that contract is printed on." She stopped in front of him, poking a manicured finger into his chest. "Do you really want to go to war with me? I know where the bodies are buried. I know about the offshore accounts. I know about the loopholes your lawyers used to secure the downtown zoning permits. I will leak every single document I have access to. I will burn the Sterling legacy to the ground, and I will stand on the ashes laughing while you try to explain to your shareholders why you chose a mute, broken child over $1 billion empire." Caleb looked at her, seeing the true depth of her malice. She didn't care about love or family or even money in the traditional sense. She cared about power, and she was willing to nuke his entire life to keep it. She was holding his legacy hostage, believing that his fear of losing his wealth would outweigh his love for his son. But she had miscalculated one critical variable. She was threatening a man who had already lost everything that mattered and had just found it again. Caleb didn't back down. He didn't flinch at the threat of financial ruin. He simply looked at his watch, marking the time. "Your 5 minutes are ticking, Tiffany," he said softly. "And you are going to need every second, because when I am done with you, the only thing you will own is a prison uniform." The chandeliers of the Grand Plaza Ballroom glittered like suspended diamonds above the heads of New York's elite, casting a golden glow over the sea of tuxedos and designer gowns. The air was thick with the murmur of gossip and the clinking of crystal champagne flutes. Tiffany Montgomery stood at the center of the room, holding court like a queen who had just conquered a kingdom. She wore a dress of crimson silk that screamed for attention, and on her finger, the heavy engagement ring weighed down her hand like a shackle of victory. She glanced toward the stage where Caleb Sterling stood adjusting his tie. She offered him a smug, knowing smile, believing that her threats had worked, and that the billionaire had bowed to her will to save his stock prices. She believed this night was her coronation. Caleb stepped up to the microphone, and the room fell into an obedient silence. He didn't look at the teleprompter. He didn't look at the investors or the press. He looked directly at Tiffany, his eyes burning with a strange, unreadable intensity. "Ladies and gentlemen," Caleb began, his voice booming through the speakers with a resonance that commanded absolute attention. "We are gathered here to celebrate the future of the Sterling family. I promised you an announcement that would change the course of this company forever. I told you I would introduce you to the woman who holds the heart of this dynasty." The crowd applauded politely, assuming he was about to call Tiffany to the stage. Tiffany took a step forward, ready to bask in the applause. But Caleb didn't say her name. Instead, he gestured toward the massive double doors at the top of the grand staircase. "Please welcome the true mother of the Sterling heir and the only woman with the strength to save this family." The doors swung open with a dramatic slowness, and the breath was sucked out of the room. It wasn't a celebrity. It wasn't an heiress from a rival family. It was Aaliyah. But this was not the maid in the stained apron who had been dragged out the back door. This was a vision of regal power that stunned the room into a paralyzed hush. Aaliyah stood at the top of the stairs, bathed in the spotlight, wearing a gown that Caleb had commissioned in secret. It was a masterpiece of midnight blue velvet that shimmered like the night sky, hugging her frame with an elegance that made the socialites in the room look like amateurs. Diamonds glittered at her throat and ears, not the gaudy stones Tiffany favored, but tasteful, radiant gems that highlighted the natural glow of her skin. Her hair, which had always been pulled back in a severe bun, was now cascading in soft waves around her shoulders. She didn't look down. She didn't tremble. She looked out at the sea of faces with a calm, dignified grace that silenced every whisper. Tiffany's glass slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a sharp shatter that echoed through the silent room. She stared up at the woman she had tormented, unable to reconcile the image of the servant with this goddess descending the stairs. Aaliyah began to walk down the steps, her movement fluid and confident. Every eye followed her. The press began to snap photos, frantically capturing the moment the narrative shifted. She wasn't an employee anymore. She was the matriarch. She walked past Tiffany without even glancing in her direction, effectively reducing the villain to a ghost in her own story. Caleb walked to the bottom of the stairs and held out his hand, not as a master to a servant, but as a man to his equal. Aaliyah took it, and the connection between them sparked with an electricity that no contract could ever manufacture. The trap had been sprung, and the queen had finally taken her throne. The silence that had fallen over the Grand Plaza ballroom was brittle and sharp, like thin glass waiting to shatter. Tiffany Montgomery recovered from her shock with a speed born of pure desperation. She watched Aaliyah standing next to Caleb, the woman she had treated as a slave, now wearing the sterling diamonds that Tiffany believed were her birthright. The humiliation burned through her veins hotter than any fire. She could feel the eyes of the investors and the press shifting away from her, and she knew she had to act immediately to destroy the charade before it took root. She marched forward, her crimson dress trailing behind her like a trail of blood. She grabbed a microphone from a stunned master of ceremonies, her knuckles white as she gripped the metal. "Stop this insanity right now!" Tiffany screamed, her voice shrill and echoing painfully through the surround sound system. She pointed a manicured finger at Aaliyah, a gesture that looked grotesque against the elegance of the evening. "Look at you all staring at her like she is royalty. Do you know who this woman is? She is not a savior. She is the help. She is the maid I fired yesterday for stealing silverware and trying to seduce my fiancé. She is a fraud from the gutter who scrubbed my toilets, and now she is standing here in a dress she could never afford, trying to trick you all." Tiffany turned to the crowd, her eyes wild. "Caleb has lost his mind. He is having a breakdown. I am the victim here. I am the one trying to protect this company, while he plays house with the staff." Aaliyah did not flinch. She did not lower her head in shame as she had done so many times before in the penthouse. She stood tall, her hand resting lightly in Caleb's palm, her face a mask of cool indifference. It was this silence that infuriated Tiffany the most. She wanted a fight. She wanted a screaming match that would drag Aaliyah down to her level. But Caleb stepped forward, shielding Aaliyah, not with his body, but with his authority. He raised his hand, and the audio engineer in the back of the room cut Tiffany's microphone. Her voice was instantly reduced to a pathetic shouting that barely reached the front row. "You are right about one thing, Tiffany," Caleb said, his voice calm and amplified clearly through the room. "We should show everyone the truth. We should show them exactly who you are when you think no one is watching. You threatened to destroy my reputation if I didn't marry you. You said you were the perfect mother. Let us see the evidence." Caleb nodded to the technical booth. The massive LED screens behind the stage, which were meant to display the quarterly earnings and the wedding monogram, flickered to life. But instead of golden graphics, a grainy high-definition black and white video filled the wall. A collective gasp went through the crowd, a sound of pure horror that seemed to suck the air out of the room. The video showed the interior of Leo's nursery. The timestamp was from 2 days ago. On the screen, Tiffany was pacing the room while Leo sat on the floor playing with a block. The audio was crystal clear. The guests heard the sickening sound of Tiffany kicking the blocks away, making the child jump. Then they heard her voice. "I hate looking at you," she hissed on the screen. "You are just like your useless father. Why couldn't you just disappear?" The video cut to another clip. This one showed Tiffany grabbing Leo by the arm and dragging him toward the closet. "I am going to lock you in here until the party is over," she snarled. "If you make one sound, I will make sure you regret it." The contrast between the smiling, elegant woman in the red dress standing in the ballroom and the monster on the screen was too much for the audience to process. A woman in the front row covered her mouth and turned away in tears. The investors who had backed Tiffany's father looked at their shoes, their faces pale with disgust. Tiffany stood frozen, her eyes glued to the giant screen where her own cruelty was being played on a loop. She watched herself slap the child. She heard herself mocking his silence. She saw the undeniable proof of her abuse broadcast on a scale of 40 feet. "It is a deep fake," Tiffany shrieked, turning back to the crowd, her hands trembling uncontrollably. "It is AI generated. Caleb made it up to frame me. None of that is real." But no one was looking at her with admiration anymore. The admiration had turned to a visceral revulsion. She was no longer the queen of the gala. She was a pariah. Caleb stepped closer to the microphone, his voice dropping to a register of lethal finality. "That video has already been sent to the NYPD and Child Protective Services, Tiffany. Along with the medical records you forged and the testimony of the staff you bribed. You wanted the spotlight. You wanted the attention of the entire world. Well, now you have it." Tiffany looked around the room, searching for an ally, for a friend, for anyone who would stand by her. But the circle had closed. Her father was nowhere to be seen, having likely slipped out the back the moment the video started. Her friends were pretending to check their phones. She was completely and utterly alone in a room full of people. Aaliyah finally stepped forward, her velvet dress catching the light. She looked at Tiffany, not with anger, but with a pity that cut deeper than any insult. "You can scream all you want," Aaliyah said softly, her voice carrying without a microphone. "But you will never hurt my son again." The security guards began to move through the crowd, not to escort Aaliyah out, but to surround the woman in the red dress. The humiliation was total. The mask had not just slipped, it had been ripped off, and the world finally saw the beast beneath the beauty. The massive LED screen behind the stage finally went dark, leaving the ballroom in a state of stunned paralysis. The image of Tiffany raising her hand against a defenseless child had burned itself into the retinas of every person in the room. Tiffany stood alone in the center of the dance floor, her crimson dress now looking less like a royal robe and more like a warning sign. She was breathing heavily, her eyes darting around the room, looking for a friendly face, looking for her father, looking for anyone who would help her spin this narrative back in her favor. But the circle of high society had closed ranks. The investors who had toasted her 10 minutes ago now looked at her with the same disdain they usually reserved for the dirt beneath their shoes. Then the heavy double doors at the entrance swung open once more. This time there was no music. There was no announcer. There was only the heavy authoritative sound of boots hitting the marble floor. 4 officers from the New York Police Department marched into the room, their dark blue uniforms creating a stark contrast to the sea of tuxedos and gowns. They moved with a grim purpose, ignoring the gasps of the socialites and the blinding flashes of the paparazzi cameras. Leading them was a detective with a face carved from stone, holding a warrant that looked like a death sentence for Tiffany's freedom. Tiffany saw them coming, and her survival instinct kicked in with a frantic, desperate energy. She took a step back, stumbling in her high heels. "You cannot be serious," she screamed, her voice cracking. "This is a private event. You have no right to be here." She turned to the security guards she had hired, the men she had treated like furniture for months. "Do something. Get them out of here. I pay your salaries." But the guards simply stepped aside, their arms folded across their chests. They had seen the video too. They had children of their own. For the first time in her life, Tiffany Montgomery's money was absolutely worthless. The detective stopped directly in front of her. He didn't shout. He didn't seem angry. He was simply doing a job. "Tiffany Montgomery," he said, his voice cutting through the hysterical edge of hers. "You are under arrest." Tiffany let out a laugh, a shrill sound that bordered on madness. "Arrested? Do you know who my father is? Do you know who I am? I will have your badge for this. I will sue this entire department into the ground." She reached out to shove the detective away, a foolish move born of a lifetime of entitlement. The detective didn't flinch. In one fluid motion, he grabbed her wrist and spun her around. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was louder than any champagne cork. It was the sound of iron finality. "You are being charged with 3 counts of felony child abuse." The detective continued reciting the list as he tightened the steel cuffs against her delicate skin. "You are also being charged with identity theft regarding the medical records of Aaliyah Jordan and multiple counts of wire fraud involving the misappropriation of funds from the Sterling Family Trust. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you use it." Tiffany struggled against the metal, the cold steel biting into her wrists. "Get these off me, Caleb. Help me." She looked up at the stage, her eyes pleading with the man she had planned to control. "Tell them this is a mistake. Tell them we are getting married." But Caleb stood motionless, his arm wrapped protectively around Aaliyah's waist. He looked down at Tiffany with an expression that held no anger, only a profound and distant pity. "The wedding is cancelled, Tiffany," Caleb said softly, his voice amplified by the microphone one last time. "And the only thing I'm going to tell them is exactly where to find the rest of the evidence." The officers began to lead her away. It was the longest walk of Tiffany's life. She was dragged past the people she had tried so hard to impress. She passed the fashion editors who were now writing headlines about her downfall. She passed the bankers who were already freezing her assets on their phones. She passed Aaliyah, who stood like a statue of grace watching the woman who had tormented her son finally face the consequences of her actions. Aaliyah didn't smile, she didn't jeer. She simply watched the wheels of justice turn, knowing that the monster was finally being put in a cage. Tiffany fought them every step of the way. She kicked and screamed, her hair coming loose from its perfect style, her makeup running down her face in streaks of black tears. She looked deranged, a stark difference from the composed socialite who had entered the room an hour ago. As they pushed her through the doors and out into the waiting police cruiser, the flashing red and blue lights illuminated her face one last time. It was a face stripped of all its masks, leaving only the raw, ugly truth underneath. The sirens wailed as the car pulled away, fading into the New York night, leaving the ballroom in a silence that felt like the first deep breath after a long suffocation. The era of Tiffany Montgomery was over, and the Sterling family was finally free. The blue lights of the police cruiser had barely faded from the tall glass windows of the ballroom, but the energy inside the room had shifted from terror to a burning curiosity. The guests who had witnessed the fall of Tiffany Montgomery were now turning their eyes back to the stage, waiting for the final piece of the puzzle to be placed. Caleb Sterling stood alone at the microphone for a moment, his hand resting on a sleek black folder that had been sitting on the podium the entire night. He looked out at the sea of faces, the investors, the partners, and the press, who were hungry for the next headline. He knew that what he was about to say would not just clear Aaliyah's name, it would rewrite the history of his family. Caleb opened the folder, the crisp sound of the paper amplifying through the silent room. He didn't look at the documents, he already memorized every line, every percentage point, and every medical stamp. He looked at Aaliyah, who was standing just a few feet away, her head held high in a way that no amount of money could buy. She was the embodiment of dignity in a room full of people who had sold theirs for a stock option. Caleb leaned into the microphone, his voice steady and vibrating with a deep emotional resonance. Tonight you have seen the darkness that was hiding in my home, he began. You saw a woman who claimed to be a mother but acted like a jailer. But you also saw something else. You saw a woman who was treated like a servant yet acted like a guardian angel. You saw a woman who was dragged out of the back door only to return through the front door, not for revenge, but for love. Caleb picked up a single sheet of paper from the folder and held it up to the light. For years I was told that my son was the result of a generic anonymous donation. I was told that his biological mother was a stranger who took a check and walked away. I was lied to. Tiffany Montgomery didn't just abuse my son, she stole his history. She paid a desperate young student to save a dying mother, and then she buried the truth under layers of fraud. But biology does not lie. Blood does not forget. Caleb paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowd. He looked directly at the camera lenses that were zooming in on his face. I hold in my hand the results of a DNA test conducted by an independent forensic laboratory this morning. It compares the genetic markers of Leo Sterling with the woman standing to my right. The room was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. Caleb's voice dropped to a whisper that carried to the back of the room. The probability of maternity is not 90%. It is not 95%. It is 99.99%. Aaliyah Jordan is not my maid. She is not a charity case. She is the biological mother of the Sterling heir. She is the woman who gave him life, and she is the only one who has ever fought to save it. The reaction was instantaneous. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom like a sudden gust of wind. Hands covered mouths and eyes widened in disbelief. The whispers started low and then swelled into a roar of realization. The maid is the mother. The phrase traveled from lip to lip, spreading like wildfire. People looked at Aaliyah with new eyes. They no longer saw the uniform she used to wear. They saw the storm gray eyes that matched the boys'. They saw the fierce, protective stance. They realized that the bond they had witnessed earlier, the way the boy clung to her, wasn't magic. It was the primal connection of blood. The socialites who had mocked her entrance were now looking at her with a mixture of shock and reverence. Aaliyah stepped forward, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She didn't need a microphone. Her presence spoke louder than words. She looked at Caleb and gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of the truth finally being set free. Caleb closed the folder and placed it back on the podium. "The lie is over," he declared, his voice ringing with finality. "The Sterling family is no longer built on deception. It is built on the truth, and tonight the rightful mother has finally come home." The applause that followed wasn't polite or restrained. It was thunderous, a standing ovation not for the billionaire, but for the woman who had walked through fire to reclaim her child. The flashbulbs erupted like fireworks, illuminating the moment a maid became a matriarch. The thunderous applause of the gala had finally faded into a dull murmur as the guests began to disperse, their whispers filling the air like the buzzing of bees. Caleb led Aaliyah off the stage and into the private VIP lounge, a quiet sanctuary of velvet and gold located just behind the main ballroom. His heart was racing with the thrill of victory. He had exposed Tiffany, he had reclaimed his son, and he had publicly acknowledged the woman who had saved them both. In his mind, the problem was solved. The equation was balanced. He reached into the inside pocket of his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a checkbook. He didn't hesitate. He uncapped his fountain pen and scribbled a number that would have made most people faint. He tore the check from the book with a crisp sound and held it out to her, his eyes shining with the pride of a man who could fix anything with a signature. "This is just the beginning, Aaliyah," Caleb said, his voice filled with a genuine desire to help. "I want to set up a trust fund for you. I want to buy you a house in whatever neighborhood you choose. You will never have to scrub a floor or worry about medical bills again. You can have the best cars, the best clothes, and anything else you desire. I am going to make sure the world knows that the mother of the Sterling heir is treated like royalty." He smiled, expecting her to take the check with tears of gratitude, expecting the happy ending that money had always bought him in the past. But Aaliyah did not reach for the paper. She didn't even look at the numbers. She looked at his hand with a profound sadness, as if he were holding a poisonous snake. Aaliyah took a step back, putting physical distance between herself and the sterling fortune. She looked around the room at the expensive art on the walls and the crystal decanters on the table. She saw the cage that had trapped her son for 3 years. She saw the luxury that had blinded a father to the abuse happening under his own roof. She looked back at Caleb and shook her head slowly, her hair catching the light. "You still don't get it, do you, Caleb?" she asked, her voice soft, but cutting through the silence like a blade. "You think this is about money. You think because I was a maid that I am desperate for your charity. You think you can write a check and erase the fact that your world almost destroyed my son." Caleb's smile faltered, his hand dropping slightly. "I don't understand," he stammered. "I am trying to make it right. I am trying to give you the life you deserve." Aaliyah walked over to the window, looking out at the city lights that seemed so cold and distant. "You can't buy what I deserve, Caleb," she said, turning back to face him. "Tiffany used your money to buy my silence. She used your money to hide her crimes. Money is the reason Leo was ignored. Money is the reason he was seen as a broken heir instead of a hurting child. I don't want your millions. I don't want your cars or your houses or your trust funds. That money is cursed, Caleb. It rots everything it touches." She walked up to him and gently pushed his hand away, closing the checkbook with a finality that echoed in the room. "I am not here to negotiate a salary for being a mother. I am here for one thing and one thing only. I am taking Leo." Caleb froze, the color draining from his face. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I mean that I am packing his things tonight, and I am taking him out of this penthouse," Aaliyah said, her voice gaining strength with every word. "I am taking him to a place where people don't care about stock prices or galas. I am taking him to a place where he can scream if he wants to, where he can get dirty and play in the grass, and where no one will ever lock him in a closet again." Caleb looked at her, panic rising in his chest. "You can't just take him. He is my son. He is the heir to this company." Aaliyah's eyes flashed with that storm-gray fire. "He is a little boy, Caleb," she said fiercely. "He is a traumatized little boy who flinches when you raise your voice. He doesn't need an empire, he needs a home. He needs peace. And he is not going to find it here, surrounded by the ghosts of what Tiffany did. I am his mother, Caleb. I carried him in my heart long before I held him in my arms. And I will not let him spend another night in a place that values his last name more than his soul." She turned toward the door, her velvet dress moving like liquid around her. "You can keep your check, Caleb. You can keep your company and your reputation, but you cannot keep my son. I am leaving now to get him. And if you try to stop me with your lawyers or your security guards, I will fight you with everything I have. And this time I won't be fighting alone, because the whole world knows the truth now." Caleb stood paralyzed in the center of the room, holding a check worth millions that had suddenly become as worthless as a piece of confetti. He watched the woman he had underestimated walk away, and he realized with a terrifying clarity that for the first time in his life, he was poor. He had all the money in the world, but he had nothing that Aaliyah wanted. She had rejected his kingdom to save the prince, and he was left standing in the ruins of his own generosity. The silence in the VIP lounge was heavy and absolute, broken only by the soft hum of the city outside the thick glass windows. Aaliyah's hand was already on the brass handle of the heavy oak door, her back turned to the man who had once commanded her to scrub his floors. Caleb Sterling stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the trappings of his immense wealth, but feeling more destitute than he ever had in his entire life. The check he had offered her, the piece of paper that represented more money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes, fluttered from his fingers. It drifted through the air in a slow spiral, landing on the Persian rug with a silence that screamed of his failure. For the first time, Caleb realized that his currency had no value here. He had tried to buy a mother's love, and he had tried to purchase forgiveness, but the market had crashed. "Aaliyah, please wait," Caleb said, his voice cracking in a way that terrified him. It wasn't the commanding boom of the CEO. It was the desperate plea of a drowning man. Aaliyah paused, her hand tightening on the door handle, but she did not turn around. She was a statue of resolve, a woman who had walked through the fire of humiliation and come out made of steel. Caleb took a step forward, but his legs felt heavy, as if the weight of his ego was finally dragging him down. He looked at her back, at the velvet dress he had bought her, and realized that the nobility she radiated didn't come from the clothes. It came from a place he couldn't access, a place of sacrifice and unconditional love. He had spent his life building walls of gold to keep out the pain of the world. He had convinced himself that emotions were liabilities, and that relationships were transactions. He had looked at Aaliyah and seen only a uniform and a debt. He had looked at Tiffany and seen a merger and an asset. How wrong he had been. How incredibly blindly stupid he had been. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, buckling his knees. He didn't think about his Italian suit. He didn't think about the dignity of his position or what the board of directors would say. Caleb Sterling, the man who never bowed to anyone, let his body sink toward the floor. The sound of his knees hitting the hard floor was a dull thud that seemed to echo through the room. Aaliyah turned around at the sound, her eyes widening in genuine shock. She had expected him to yell. She had expected him to call security. She had expected him to throw money at her until she suffocated. She did not expect to see the master of the universe kneeling at her feet, his head bowed low, his hands open and empty. The arrogance that had defined his jawline and his posture was gone, dissolved by the acid of his own shame. He looked up at her, and his eyes were swimming with tears that he made no move to wipe away. "I am not asking you to take the money," Caleb whispered, his voice trembling. "I am not asking you to stay because of my power. I am kneeling because I have nothing left to offer you but the truth. You were right, Aaliyah. You were right about everything. I was the poor one. I was the one living in poverty. I had billions in the bank, but my soul was bankrupt. I looked at you and I judged you for your debt, but you were rich in everything that actually matters. You were rich in courage. You were rich in love. And I was starving." He took a shaky breath, his gaze locked on hers. "I let a monster into our home because she looked the part. I let her hurt our son because I was too busy staring at spreadsheets to look into his eyes. I failed him, Aaliyah. I failed him every single day for 3 years, and when you came to save him, I treated you like a criminal. The shame of that is going to burn me for the rest of my life. I don't deserve to be his father. I know that. I don't deserve to stand next to you. But please, I am begging you, do not take him away from me completely." Caleb reached out, but he didn't touch her. He kept his hand hovering in the air, a gesture of submission. "I don't want to buy you a house. I want to build a home. I want to learn from you. I want to know how to be the parent that Leo needs, because clearly I have no idea what I am doing. I am terrified, Aaliyah. I am terrified that if you walk out that door, you will take the only light that has ever been in this family with you. Teach me. Punish me if you have to. Make me start from the bottom. I will scrub the floors if that is what it takes to earn your respect. Just don't leave me alone in this cold, empty castle." Aaliyah looked down at him, her expression softening by degrees. She saw the man stripped of his armor. She saw the father who had finally woken up from a long nightmare. The power dynamic had shifted completely. The billionaire was gone, and in his place was a man who was finally ready to listen. The room was silent, save for the sound of Caleb's ragged breathing, waiting for her judgment, waiting to see if his surrender was enough to save the only thing he had left. The heavy oak door to the VIP lounge creaked open, breaking the suffocating silence that had settled over the room like a thick blanket. Caleb was still on his knees, his expensive suit fabric pressed against the hard floor, his eyes red and raw from a vulnerability he had never dared to show before. Aaliyah stood frozen, her hand hovering near the doorframe, her heart torn between the justice she deserved and the mercy he was begging for. But the sound of the door opening shifted the axis of the entire world. Standing there, framed by the bright lights of the hallway, was the nanny holding the small hand of Leo Sterling. The boy looked small in his miniature tuxedo, a tiny figure lost in a world of giants and noise. His eyes wide and storm gray scanned the room with a frantic intensity, looking for the one anchor that had kept him from drifting away during the chaos of the night. He saw his father kneeling on the floor, a posture that must have looked terrifyingly strange to a child who had only ever seen him towering like a statue of ice. He saw the tears on Caleb's face, and for a moment, fear flickered across Leo's features. But then his gaze shifted. He saw the midnight blue velvet. He saw the cascading dark hair. He saw Aaliyah. The fear evaporated instantly, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated relief. It was the look of a sailor finally spotting the lighthouse after months at sea. Leo pulled his hand free from the nanny's grip, with a strength that surprised her. He didn't walk. He didn't hesitate. He ran. His small patent leather shoes slapped against the Persian rug as he crossed the distance between them. He ignored the billionaire on the floor. He ignored the luxury of the room. He threw himself at Aaliyah, his little arms wrapping around her legs, burying his face in the soft fabric of her gown. Aaliyah fell to her knees instinctively, ignoring the priceless dress dropping down to his level so she could wrap him in her arms. She buried her face in his neck, smelling the baby shampoo and the innocent scent of childhood that she had fought so hard to protect. "You are safe, Leo," she whispered against his skin, her voice trembling. "I have you. I will never let you go." But Leo pulled back slightly. He placed his small hands on Aaliyah's wet cheeks, his thumbs brushing away her tears, with a tenderness that broke Caleb's heart from across the room. The boy took a deep, shaky breath. His chest heaved as he fought against the invisible walls that had kept his voice imprisoned for 3 years. His lips parted, and his jaw worked, struggling to coordinate the muscles that Tiffany had trained him to suppress. The room seemed to hold its breath. Caleb stopped breathing entirely, watching his son fight a battle he hadn't known was being waged. "I want," Leo started, his voice raspy and unused, sounding like dry leaves rustling in the wind. He stopped, his brow furrowing with the effort. Aaliyah nodded, encouraging him with her eyes, telling him without words that he was safe, that no one would hurt him for speaking. Leo swallowed hard and tried again, his voice gaining a sudden surprising strength. "I want to go home," he said, the words tumbling out faster now. He looked directly into Aaliyah's eyes, his gaze piercing and absolute. "I want to go home with Mommy Aaliyah." The sentence hung in the air, vibrating with a truth so powerful it seemed to shake the foundations of the building. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was a declaration of belonging. For 3 years, the world had debated who Leo belonged to. The lawyers said he belonged to the Sterling estate. The doctors said he belonged to the Spectrum. Tiffany said he belonged to the nursery. But Leo had just cast the only vote that mattered. He didn't say he wanted to go to the penthouse. He didn't say he wanted his toys. He defined home not as a place, but as a person. Mommy Aaliyah. He had combined the title he had been denied with the name of the only person who had earned it. Caleb let out a sound that was half sob and half gasp. The words Mommy Aaliyah hit him with the force of a physical blow, shattering the last remnants of his composure. He had offered Aaliyah millions of dollars. He had offered her houses and cars. But his son had just given her something that all of Caleb's billions could never buy. He had given her the title she had sacrificed her own body to save. Caleb covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking violently as the magnitude of his failure and the beauty of this redemption washed over him. He realized that he was a stranger in this intimate moment. He was a bystander witnessing a miracle that he had almost destroyed. Aaliyah pulled Leo into her chest, crying openly now. She rocked him back and forth, kissing the top of his head over and over again. "We will go home, baby," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We will go home right now." She looked up at Caleb over the boy's shoulder. Her eyes were no longer cold. They were filled with a mixture of sorrow and a new tentative understanding. She didn't have to say anything. The look said it all. She had won, love had won, and as she stood up lifting the heavy boy into her arms as if he weighed nothing, she carried him toward the door. She didn't look back at the check on the floor. She walked out of the room carrying her world in her arms, leaving the billionaire alone with his gold and the echo of the first sentence his son had ever spoken. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom on the 50th floor of the Sterling Tower did not slam shut this time. They remained open, allowing the morning sun to flood into a room that had historically been a chamber of shadows and cutthroat deals. The long mahogany table was crowded not with blueprints for new skyscrapers or aggressive acquisition contracts, but with the stunned faces of the board of directors. They sat in uncomfortable silence, adjusting their ties and checking their watches, unable to comprehend the emergency meeting agenda that lay before them. At the head of the table, Caleb Sterling stood. He was not wearing the armor of his three-piece Italian suit. He was dressed in a simple button-down shirt, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, looking less like a king of industry and more like a man ready to work. Gentlemen and ladies. Caleb began, his voice steady and calm, echoing off the glass walls that overlooked the city he had spent his life trying to own. For 3 generations, the name Sterling has been synonymous with real estate. We have built towers that scrape the sky. We have turned neighborhoods into gold mines. We have measured our success in square footage and occupancy rates. I have spent my entire adult life believing that if I built the walls high enough and the foundations deep enough, I could control the world. The board members nodded slowly, expecting a speech about a new merger or a hostile takeover. But Caleb paused, looking over at the corner of the room where Aaliyah sat. She was holding Leo on her lap, reading him a story in a hushed tone. The sight of them grounded him, giving him the strength to say the words that would burn his legacy to the ground. But I was wrong. Caleb continued, his voice dropping to a register of profound humility. I built castles of glass, but I lived in a prison of silence. I was so obsessed with the structure of buildings that I ignored the structure of my own family. I let a little boy suffer in a room worth millions because I didn't understand that his voice was more valuable than any property in my portfolio. I chased profit while my son chased a mother's love. And I will not make that mistake for one more second. He picked up a thick stack of documents from the table and held them up. This is the dissolution paperwork for Sterling Global Real Estate. A collective gasp went through the room. One director stood up, his face purple with shock. Caleb, you cannot be serious. You are talking about liquidating billions of dollars in assets. You are talking about ending a dynasty. Caleb smiled, a genuine warm expression that none of them had ever seen before. No, I am talking about starting a new one. As of this morning, every commercial property, every luxury apartment complex, and every undeveloped lot owned by this company is being sold. The proceeds will not go into my pocket. They will not go into offshore accounts. Caleb walked over to the whiteboard behind him and picked up a marker. He wrote 2 names in bold letters: the Leo and Aaliyah Foundation for Communication and Neurodiversity. He turned back to the room. We are pivoting. We are no longer in the business of housing bodies. We are in the business of freeing minds. This capital will be used to establish a nationwide network of centers dedicated to speech-language pathology and autism support. These centers will not be cold clinical environments. They will be sanctuaries. They will provide the best therapy, the best equipment, and the best specialists in the world. And they will do it for free. No mother will ever have to sell her eggs to pay for treatment. No child will ever be locked in a closet because the world doesn't understand their language. Aaliyah looked up from her book, her eyes widening as she saw her name written on the board. She hadn't asked for this. She had only asked for Leo. But Caleb was giving her the tools to save 1,000 Leos. He was taking the dirty money that Tiffany had worshipped, and he was washing it clean with a purpose that actually mattered. Caleb walked over to her, ignoring the sputtering protests of the board members. He knelt down next to Leo's chair. You are the CEO of this new empire, Aaliyah, Caleb said softly. You are the expert. You are the heart. I am just the bank account. I want you to run it. I want you to hire the therapists who were fired for caring too much. I want you to design the sensory rooms. I want you to teach me and the rest of the world how to listen." Aaliyah reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines of a man who had finally found his soul. "You are crazy," she whispered, a smile touching her lips. "You are throwing away a kingdom." Caleb shook his head, looking at his son who was tracing the letters on the cover of his book. "I am not throwing it away. I am trading it in. I thought power was about commanding a room. Now I know power is about helping a child speak their first sentence." He stood up and turned back to the stunned room. "The meeting is adjourned," Caleb declared. "You have your severance packages. I have a lot of work to do." He reached out and took Leo's hand and then Aaliyah's. Together, the three of them walked out of the boardroom, leaving the papers scattered on the table. They walked past the secretaries and the analysts, past the awards and the trophies. They stepped into the elevator, and as the doors closed, blocking out the view of the high-rise empire Caleb had built, he didn't feel a sense of loss. He felt lighter than air. The numbers on the screen ticked down, taking them to the ground floor, to the street, to the real world. The billionaire was dead. The father was alive. And for the first time in the history of the Sterling name, they were not building a monument to themselves. They were building a future where every voice, no matter how small, could finally be heard. The autumn sun cast long golden shadows across the quiet street in Brooklyn as Caleb Sterling parked the modest sedan against the curb. It was a far cry from the armored limousines and police escorts that used to define his arrival, but Caleb had learned that true power did not need a siren to announce itself. He killed the engine and looked over at Aaliyah. She was looking out the window, her expression a mix of curiosity and hesitation. She had spent the last month adjusting to this new reality, helping him dismantle his corporate empire and turn it into something that actually healed people. But today, Caleb had been secretive. He had insisted on driving her herself, leaving Leo with his new favorite therapist for the afternoon so they could have this moment alone. "Where are we, Caleb?" Aaliyah asked, her voice soft. "This doesn't look like a board meeting or a press conference." Caleb smiled, a genuine expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "That is because it isn't. Come with me." He got out and walked around to open her door, offering his hand. She took it, and the warmth of his skin against hers grounded him. He led her not to a skyscraper but to a 3-story red brick building that stood on the corner. It was old and covered in ivy, with large arched windows that looked like eyes watching the neighborhood. It had character. It had a soul. Caleb pulled a heavy set of keys from his pocket and unlocked the front double doors. The air inside smelled of sawdust and fresh paint, the scent of a new beginning. Aaliyah stepped onto the hardwood floor and her eyes widened. It was a massive open space filled with natural light. But it wasn't empty. There were contractors working quietly in the corners, and as Aaliyah looked closer, she realized what they were building. She saw the frames for sensory swings bolted into the reinforced ceiling. She saw the soundproof observation rooms with one-way glass. She saw the small, cozy alcoves designed for children who needed to escape the noise of the world. "This is a clinic," Aaliyah whispered, turning in a slow circle. "It is designed perfectly. The lighting is dimmable. The acoustics are dampened." Caleb, who is this for Caleb, walked over to the center of the room, his footsteps echoing slightly. He looked nervous. The man who had negotiated billion-dollar mergers without breaking a sweat was trembling slightly as he stood before her. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small black velvet box. Aaliyah froze, her breath hitched in her throat. She looked at the box and then at his face. "Please, Caleb," she said, her voice filled with a sudden panic. "I told you I don't want diamonds. I don't want a ring that costs more than this neighborhood. I am not Tiffany. I don't need a rock to prove that I matter." Caleb shook his head quickly, stepping closer. "Open it," he said softly. "Trust me, Aaliyah. It is not a ring." Aaliyah hesitated, her fingers trembling as she took the box. She lifted the lid, expecting to see gold or platinum. Instead, nestled in the black velvet was a single antique brass key. It was heavy and weathered, a master key that looked like it belonged to a different era. She looked up at him confused. Caleb took a deep breath. I spent my whole life thinking that a marriage was a contract sealed with a diamond. I gave Tiffany a ring that was flawless and cold, just like our relationship. But I don't want to give you a stone, Aaliyah. I want to give you a purpose. He gestured to the room around them. This isn't just a clinic. This is the Aaliyah Jordan Academy. I bought the building, but I need you to make it a home. This is the school you wrote about in your journals, the one you dreamed of starting before life forced you to sell your dreams to save your mother. I found your old notebooks, Aaliyah. I saw the drawings. I saw the curriculum you designed for nonverbal children. I built the walls, but you are the only one who can fill them with voice. Caleb took the key from the box and pressed it into her palm, closing her fingers over it. I am not asking you to just be my wife, Aaliyah. I am asking you to be my partner. I am asking you to run this place. I want you to be the director. I want you to hire the staff. I want you to save the children that the world has given up on, just like you saved Leo. This key opens every door in this building, but it also opens the door to the only future I want. Aaliyah looked down at the key in her hand. It felt warm from his touch. She looked at the sensory swings and the therapy rooms, and she saw her own soul reflected in the architecture. He hadn't bought her a trinket. He had listened to her silence and built her a megaphone. Tears spilled over her lashes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of pure, overwhelming validation. She looked at Caleb, seeing the vulnerability in his storm-gray eyes. You didn't buy me a ring, she whispered, a smile breaking through her tears. You bought me a school. Caleb shrugged, a boyish grin appearing on his face. I figured a diamond sits in a box, but a school changes the world. So what do you say, Aaliyah? Will you take the job, and will you take the man who comes with it? Aaliyah didn't answer with words. She threw her arms around his neck, pulling him down into a kiss that tasted of sawdust and hope and a promise that would last longer than any diamond. She held the key tight in her fist, holding on to her dream and her love at the very same time. The billionaire had finally made the smartest investment of his life. The golden light of the late afternoon sun filtered through the turning leaves of Central Park, creating a canopy of fire and amber above their heads. It was the kind of autumn day that usually sent New Yorkers rushing to grab pumpkin spice lattes and hurry back to their offices, but for the Sterling family, time had finally slowed down. Caleb walked along the winding paved path, his hands tucked into the pockets of a casual wool coat that cost a fraction of his old suits. He breathed in the crisp air, smelling the damp earth and the distant scent of roasted nuts from a street vendor. For 40 years he had looked at this park from the window of his penthouse, regarding it merely as a patch of green that increased his property value. Today, walking through it, he realized it was a living, breathing world that he was finally a part of. Ahead of them, Leo was chasing a squirrel, his laughter ringing out clear and bright like a bell. He wasn't the silent, terrified boy hiding in the corner of a nursery anymore. He was vibrant. He stopped to examine a fallen leaf, tracing its veins with his fingers, his storm-gray eyes wide with wonder. He pointed at a street musician playing a saxophone and looked back at his parents. Music, he said, clearly testing the word on his tongue. Caleb felt a lump form in his throat. Every word his son spoke was a victory. Every smile was a dividend that paid out more than any stock he had ever owned. Caleb looked at Aaliyah walking beside him. She wore a simple trench coat and a scarf, her hair loose and blowing in the breeze. She noticed him staring and smiled. "What are you thinking about, Caleb?" she asked. He stopped walking and turned to face the city skyline rising above the trees. The buildings glittered in the sun, monuments to money and power. "I am thinking about how blind I was," Caleb admitted. "I walked through this city for decades, and I never saw the people. I saw net worths. I saw assets and liabilities. I saw the waiters and the doormen and the cleaners as invisible gears in a machine that served me. I didn't see their faces. I didn't see their stories." He looked at her with an intensity that made the rest of the park fade away. Then I met you. I tried to make you invisible too. I put you in a uniform and told you to use the back door. But you forced me to look. You forced me to see that the woman scrubbing the floor had more dignity in her little finger than the woman sitting at the head of the table. You taught me that status is a lie we tell ourselves to feel important. The only thing that truly measures a person is how they treat the ones who can do nothing for them. You saved Leo from silence, but you saved me from being a hollow shell. Aaliyah reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. The warmth of her touch was the only validation he needed. You learned the hardest lesson of all, Caleb, she said softly. You learned that kindness is not a weakness. It is the only thing that holds the world together. Tiffany had all the status in the world, but she was empty. You have lost your title and your empire, but look at what you have found. She gestured toward Leo, who was now trying to feed a piece of a pretzel to a pigeon with infinite patience. You found the truth. And the truth is that love doesn't care about the name on the building. It cares about the people inside it. Caleb squeezed her hand. I promise you, Aaliyah, I will never forget it. I will spend the rest of my life trying to be the man you saw in me when everyone else just saw a checkbook. I want Leo to grow up knowing that his worth isn't in his last name. I want him to know that he is valuable simply because he exists and because he is kind. Aaliyah nodded, her eyes shining. He already knows that, she said. He learned it from his father. Leo ran back to them, his face flushed with the cold and happiness. Mommy, Daddy, come on, he yelled, grabbing both of their hands. The ducks are waiting. Caleb laughed, a sound that was free of burden and pretense. He let his son pull him forward away from the skyline and deeper into the park. People walked past them, tourists and joggers and business people. They didn't see a billionaire and a maid. They didn't see a scandal or a headline. They just saw a family. A father, a mother, and a son walking together under the golden trees. As they walked further down the path, disappearing into the tapestry of the city, Caleb Sterling finally understood the legacy he was leaving behind. It wasn't written in concrete or steel. It was written in the laughter of a boy who had found his voice, and in the love of a woman who had taught a king how to be a man. The story of the Sterling Empire had ended, but the story of the Sterling family had just begun. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, it was the most beautiful thing Caleb had ever seen. The story of Caleb Sterling and Aaliyah Jordan serves as a profound reminder that the most valuable things in life are often the ones that come without a price tag. We live in a society that is deeply obsessed with appearances, where we are conditioned to believe that success is measured by the size of a bank account or the prestige of a title. Caleb was the embodiment of this blindness. He had spent his entire life building a fortress of wealth, believing that his net worth was synonymous with his self-worth. He allowed a woman like Tiffany into his inner circle, simply because she fit the aesthetic of his world. She was polished and wealthy and socially acceptable, but underneath that glittering surface, she was hollow. Caleb was so dazzled by the shine of his own empire that he missed the diamond hiding in the dust right under his nose. The true tragedy of the beginning of this story was not that Caleb was rich, but that he was spiritually bankrupt. He looked at Aaliyah and saw only a uniform. He saw a servant who was beneath him and unworthy of his attention. He failed to see that the woman scrubbing his floors possessed a nobility and a grace that his billions could never purchase. This narrative teaches us that status is the greatest illusion of all. A title like CEO means absolutely nothing if you cannot hear the silent cries of your own child. Aaliyah showed us that true power is not found in commanding a boardroom or intimidating employees, but in the quiet, relentless courage of standing up for the vulnerable. She taught us that love is an action, not a transaction. She sacrificed her biological legacy to save her dying mother, and she risked her freedom and her reputation to save a son who could not speak for himself. That is a richness of spirit that Caleb had to lose everything to finally understand. The ultimate lesson here is to look closer at the people around us. We must stop judging others by the cars they drive or the jobs they hold and start measuring them by the content of their character. We need to realize that sometimes the heroes in our lives are wearing aprons instead of capes, and the people who truly love us are the ones who are willing to hold our hand even when we have nothing left to offer them. True wealth is found in the safety of a home built on truth and the unconditional love of a family. If this story touched your heart and made you believe in the power of second chances, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more emotional tales that explore the depths of the human soul.